Shabbat Shalom once again, brothers and sisters. At this time, we'll turn the services over to the great future priest, Deacon Yisrayl Abel.
Shabbat Shalom, everyone. You may be seated. May the peace of Yahweh be with each and every one of you. The title of my sermon today is Salt, a Blessing or a Curse. Now, almost any doctor will tell you that salt is bad for you, or to limit your salt intake. They say it's bad for your heart. For example, there was an article that was entitled Recommendation for Cancer Research, and it said that, quote, consuming too much salt can be harmful to our health, increasing our risk of stomach cancer as well as high blood pressure. Well, let's take a look at what Yahweh says about salt. In Leviticus chapter 2 and verse 13, and it's found on page 82. Leviticus 2 and verse 13. And it says, every offering of your grain offerings you shall season with salt. You shall not allow the salt of the covenant of Yahweh to be lacking from your grain offering. With all your offerings you shall offer salt. So there we see that every offering should be seasoned with salt. And all of Yahweh's 613 laws are for the benefit of our hearts and our minds and bodies. Even though the human body is very complex, Yahweh doesn't leave us guessing at how to take care of our body. He tells us how to keep ourselves healthy. He tells us what would hurt us. And when Yahweh's laws are obeyed, they bring us great health. I have an article. It's entitled 16 Reasons Why Eating Unrefined Salt Benefits Our Health. It says unrefined salt benefits important functions of real salt in the body. And I'm not going to read all of them. I'm only going to read a few. First one, it says stabilizes irregular heartbeat and regulates blood pressure in conjunction with water. The fourth one is essential for the generation of hydroelectric energy in the cells of the body. 5 is vital for the absorption of nutrient components through the intestinal tract. 6 is needed to clear the lungs of mucus and sticky phlegm, particularly in those suffering from asthma. 9 can prevent muscle cramps. 11 makes bones firm. 27% of the body's salt content is located in the bones. Salt deficiency and or eating refined salt versus real salt are major causes of osteoporosis. And the last one, number 16, supplies the body with over 80 essential mineral elements. Refined salt, such as the common table salt, has been stripped of all but 2 of these elements. In addition, refined commercial salt contains harmful additives, including aluminum silicate, a primary cause of Alzheimer's disease. So the refined salt, the salt that goes through all the processes, actually has stuff that can hurt you, and they strip it of most of its essential minerals. It goes on to say the miracle of unrefined salt benefits. Natural sea salt contains 92 essential minerals, whereas refined adulterated salt, a byproduct of the chemical industry, contains only 2 elements, sodium, Na, and chlorine, Ci. When cells suffer from a dietary deficiency of trace elements, they lose their ability to control their ions. This has dire consequences on the human body. It says, before salt was commercially produced, it was considered the most precious commodity on earth, even more precious than gold. In recent years, salt has earned a bad reputation, and people have learned to fear it. In the same way they fear cholesterol in sunlight. Many doctors warn their patients to stay away from sodium and sodium-rich foods. However, to live a salt-free life means that you will suffer an increased risk of mineral and trace mineral deficiencies, as well as numerous related complications. Eating unrefined salt fulfills the body's need for salt without upsetting the hydroelectric balance. So in that article, we see that eating the unrefined or the unadulterated salt, the natural salt, there are many benefits from it. But the salt that goes through all the processes of the bleaching, the taking out of minerals, the adding of different things, those can hurt your body. Your body, it says in that article that it says that refined salt has no benefits for the body. Talking about the stuff that goes through the processes of bleaching and the taking out of minerals, it says it has no benefits for the body. And it said that it is responsible for causing numerous health problems. So the salt that Yahweh created, the natural salt, is actually healthy for you. But the world always thinks that they have something better. Well, this stuff doesn't clump up, but it can actually hurt your body. And remember what we've heard numerous times from Pastor Yisrayl Hawkins, how cancer cannot enter a cell that has salt in it. In the prophetic word, 2005 prophetic word, on page 19, under the heading, Today's Salt Has Lost Its Saltiness, it says, most people do not realize there are different forms of salt. Not realizing this has caused many unnecessary controversies regarding salt. There's natural salt and there's common table salt. Most salt producing companies dry their salt in huge kilns with temperatures reaching 1200 degrees Fahrenheit. This process changes the chemical structure. During this heating process, the element sodium chloride goes off into the air as a gas. What remains is sodium hydroxide, which is actually irritating to our bodies. Then chemicals like silico illuminates, potassium iodide, tricalcium phosphate, magnesium carbonate, sodium bicarbonate, and yellow prussiate of soda are added. The chemical additives which prevent the refined salt from absorbing water while it is in the box also prevent the refined salt from being properly absorbed in your body. When they have finished refining your salt, it looks great and flows easily out of your salt shaker. But 82 of the 84 mineral elements have been extracted. So they take out a lot of these elements that are actually healthy for your body, and then they add all those things to prevent it from absorbing water and clumping up in the box. If you'll turn over to Yachanan Mark, chapter 9, and look at verse 50. That's found on page 770. Yachanan Mark 9 and verse 50. And it says, salt is healthy in form and nature, but if the salt has lost its saltiness, with what will you season it? Have salt in yourselves and be at peace with one another. Now our bodies require certain minerals and vitamins for growth and activity, and salt is needed for the proper absorption of certain minerals. Now it's Yahweh that we should put our trust in, not in the doctors of the world that tell us to limit our salt intake, but we should trust in Yahweh. Turn over to Psalms, praise Yahweh. Psalms 118 and verse 8. And that's found on page 482. Psalms 118 and verse 8. And it says, it is better to trust in Yahweh than to put confidence in man. So trust in Yahweh. And for your notes, Proverbs 3 verses 5 through 8, talking about trusting in Yahweh and not leaning upon your own understanding. And when we follow everything that Yahweh tells us to do, through Pastor Yisrayl Hawkins, when we follow all these things, then we will experience better health. And remember, with everything we do it with a grain of salt. And with that, I'll turn it over to the next speaker, the great Kahan Yeshua Hyler Hawkins.
Praise Yahweh. You may all be seated. May the peace of Yahweh be with each and every one of you. Today I'm going to get into a subject that Pastor brought up again a few weeks ago, and he continues to bring up. He said it's something that people keep falling into, but I'm going to try to discuss and try to offer a solution, a peaceful solution on how to stop it. But the title of my sermon is going to be Reshaping Our Behavior by Allowing Yahweh's House to Make Us in His Image. And we know that obedience, submission is the key. Submitting to the one that's been sent, to the one that's been sent to teach us. That's the key to overcoming. That's the key to getting our mind to the point to where Yahweh can now use us, to where He can shape us, to where He can mold us into the servant He wants us to be. Pastor mentioned a story about a man who asked his sons to do something. I'll be turning over to Jeremiah chapter 35. I'm sure many of you remember this story, but I just want to recall it to our remembrance, and so we can understand exactly the obedience that these men showed towards the instructions that they were given. It's on page 603, Jeremiah chapter 35, and let's start in verse 1. It says, "This is the word which came to Jeremiah from Yahweh in the days of Joachim, son of Josiah, the king of Judah, saying, Go to the house of the Rechabites, and speak to them, and bring them into the house of Yahweh, into the chambers, and give them wine to drink. So I went to get Yezaniah, the son of Jeremiah, the son of Hasbaniah, and his brothers, and all his sons, and the whole house of the Rechabites, and brought them into the house of Yahweh, into the room of the sons of Hanan, the son of Yigdaliah, the man of Yahweh, which was next to the room of the officials, and above the room of Messiah, son of Shalom, the keeper of the door. Then I placed pitchers of wine and cups before the sons of the house of Rechab, and I said to them, Drink some wine. But they said, We will not drink no wine, because Jonadab, son of Rechab, our father, commanded us, saying, You must drink no wine, you nor your sons, forever. So they weren't being rebellious towards Jeremiah for this. They were simply putting the fact that we have been given instruction. All right, we were given instructions not to participate in this. And you'll see here in verse 7, they were also given other instructions. It says, You must not build a house or sow a seed or plant a vineyard nor possess them, but all your days you must live in tents, so that you may live many days in the land where you are sojourners. He said, And so we have obeyed the voice of Jonadab, the son of Rechab, our father, in all that he charged us to drink no wine all the days, we, our wives, our sons, and our daughters. Does anybody remember someone else asking us this? Not to participate in this stuff anymore? I believe it was the one that was sent to us, the one that gave us those instructions. And this is the story he gave us when he gave those instructions. So pay very close attention. In verse 9 he says, Nor to build houses for ourselves to live in, nor do we have vineyards, fields, or seed. But we have lived in tents and have obeyed and performed all that Jonadab our father has commanded us. And it was only when Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, invaded the land that we said, Come and let us go to Jerusalem to escape the Chaldean and the Armenian armies. And this is why we are living in Jerusalem. Then the word of Yahweh came to Jeremiah, saying, This is what Yahweh of hosts, father of Israel, says, Go and tell the men of Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, Will you never receive instructions and listen to my word, says Yahweh? The instructions that Jonadab, son of Rechab, gave to his sons, never to drink wine, are performed. For to this day they drink none, and are obedient to their father's commandment. But I have spoken to you, rising early and speaking, yet you have not obeyed me. I have also sent all my servants, the prophets, to you, rising up early and sending them, saying, Turn now, every one of you, and from your evil way, and amend your doings, so that you do not go after hinder gods to serve them. Then you will live in the land which I have given you, you and your fathers. He says, But you have not inclined your ear and paid attention, nor have listened to me. Yes, the sons of Jonadab, he says, the son of Rechab, have performed the commandment which he gave them. But this people Israel has not obeyed. They have not obeyed me. Therefore, this is what Yahweh, Almighty of hosts, the Father of Israel, says, Behold, I will bring on Judah. He says, and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, all the disaster I have pronounced against them. Or in other words, Yahweh is going to allow these judgments to take place because of the disobedience. For I have spoken to them, but they have not listened. I have called to them, but they have not answered. But to the house of the Rechabites, Jeremiah said, This is what Yahweh of hosts, the Father of Israel, says, Because you have obeyed the commandment of Jonadab your father, and have kept all his precepts and performed all that he has commanded you. Therefore, this is what Yahweh of hosts, the Father of Israel, says, Jonadab, the son of Rechab, will never lack a man to stand before me forever. using the obedience that these men shown to the instructions they were given as an example for the rest of us, showing us it's through obedience. It's through obedience. No matter what it is, it's the instructions, and sticking strictly following those instructions that's given to us is what gets us there. All right, but why? Why is wine such a big problem? Why is strong drink such a big problem? Why are these things mentioned? Because it leads us to a point. Uncontrolled, these things get us to the point where we cut ourselves off from Yahweh. Be turning over to Isaiah chapter 5. Isaiah chapter 5, it's on page 533. Look at verse 11. It says, "Woe to those who rise up early in the morning, so they may follow strong drink, who continue until night, until the wine inflames them." Now see if this sounds familiar in verse 12. "The harp and the lyre and the tambourine and the flute and the wine are in their feast, but they do not regard the work of Yahweh, nor consider or understand the operation of his hands." How many of us remember the feast when there was drinking, partying, sitting around the campfires, playing guitars, the music? How many remember that? Remember what Pastor said, the instructions he gave us? Yahweh's feast are working feast. He told us, he gave us instructions. He said to consider my feast. Consider the work. That's where our minds need to be. Not foolish playing around, drinking, and sitting around partying. Those things will lead to our destruction. Turning over to Proverbs chapter 23. Proverbs chapter 23, and look at verse 19. Proverbs 23:19, he says, "Hear, my son, be wise and guide your mind in the way. Do not be among those who drink too much wine, nor among the gluttons who eat all kinds of meat. For the drunkard and the glutton will come to poverty, and rags will clothe those who are lulled into sleep." So you see the combination here, the combination of those who are drunk. They're compared also to a glutton. All right, now a glutton is somebody who can't control their appetite. All right, if it's there in front of them, they eat it. All right, that's what a true glutton is. They eat all kinds of meats, whether it's beef, chicken, pork, whatever. Those pig-eating priests, that's what he's talking about. But this forms a certain thing, and it creates a certain mentality within our mind. It creates a certain barrier within our mind to where now we don't have goals set for ourselves. To where now we shut off the idea of actually obtaining a certain possession or obtaining a certain goal that we had set for ourselves at one time. Be turning over to Leviticus chapter 10, and we're going to see the consequences that some people suffered for these actions. Leviticus chapter 10. We'll start here in verse 1. It's on page 88. It says, "Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, each took a censer and put a fire in it and put incense on it and offered unauthorized, profane fire in front of Yahweh, contrary to his law." So they knew this was the law. It wasn't something that was a surprise to them. They understood this law from the beginning. In verse 2, "So fire came out from Yahweh and devoured them, and they died in front of Yahweh. Now then Moshe said to Aaron, 'This is what Yahweh spoke of when he said, among those who come near me, I must be sanctified, regarded as holy, and before all the people, I must be glorified.' And Aaron held his peace." All right, so they were already given these instructions. They understood these things. But look at verse 8. "Then Yahweh spoke to Aaron, saying, 'Do not drink wine nor strong drink, you nor your sons with you, when you go into the tent of meeting, or you shall die. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations.'" But he just doesn't leave it off there. He explains why you will die, why not to do it. In verse 10, "You must distinguish between the holy and unholy, and between the unclean and the clean." So he shows right there, having too much wine, becoming drunk, being drunk with anything. All right, it's not just wine, it's not just strong drink. We can become drunk through our own lust, to where our mind now can't focus completely. All right, any mind-altering drugs, marijuana, all these things, they get our mind to where now we can't make a rational decision. It gets us to the point to where now we don't understand what's right and wrong. How are we supposed to make a proper choice if we don't understand how to make a proper choice? And to be honest, this is actually something that Yeshua Messiah spoke of, and it's actually something that came out in a news article, and this was called, what they call it an actual In neuroscience, they call it a certain thing that affects the brain and affects the certain portion of the brain. And it's called hypofrontality. Hypofrontality, to where it affects the front part of the brain. This is the part that actually helps you to maintain self-control. So let's see exactly what this does to you. But not only alcohol. Alcohol affects all parts of the brain, okay? 4 parts of the brain, it affects all of them. You can't hear, you can't think, and you can't act, all right? It affects everything to where you can't make a proper choice. The same thing with marijuana. Marijuana destroys what? Your short-term memories. Marijuana destroys your mind to where you can't retain new information. These things affect the brain, but let's see exactly what else affects the brain. Now, the main part of this story, and the main thing this focuses on, was pornography. But the man goes into it, and he takes it and combines it with all fantasy. Anything fantasy. And fantasy is something that we create within our mind, something we imagine. We imagine to take us away from reality. So let's see what this does to us. Compulsiveness is a good descriptor of hypofrontality. Even when negative consequences seem imminent, impulse control is too weak to battle the cravings. The fantasy-addicted brain has trouble thinking logically. When impulses and desires come from the midbrain instead of being moderated, the brain feels these desires as compelling needs. The prefrontal region is supposed to be able to weigh out the consequences in situations and judiciously shut down the cravings. In other words, this helps us to choose righteousness. It helps us to rationalize those thoughts, those thoughts and feelings and actions. It helps us to stop before we get to those negative consequences. It helps us to decide, well, is this going to bring a positive reward or a negative consequence? All right, but fantasy, it actually affects the brain to where we're unable to do this. He says the prefrontal region is supposed to be able to weigh out the consequences and situations and judiciously shut down the cravings, but hyperfrontality means the addict's ability to do this is impaired. Impaired, just like the alcohol, just like using the marijuana, it affects the mind. Now, what causes hyperfrontality? It says, compared to other creatures on earth, human beings have a very well-developed prefrontal region. When our prefrontal lobes are working properly, then we have executive control or self-control. We're able to practice this self-control. And the process is going on in our brains. It's where we do our abstract thinking. We make goals and we solve problems. We regulate behavior, and where we suppress emotions, impulses, and urge. But the more one participates in fantasy, the more dopamine is released in the brain. Eventually, dopamine receptors and signals in the brain fatigue, leaving the viewer wanting more, but unable to reach a level of satisfaction. So always having that desire for more entertainment, more sin, more fantasy, something that pulls me more out of life, but never being able to be satisfied. And the viewer becomes numb to the things once considered pleasurable. Righteousness, doing the work of Yahweh, coming to classes, participating in things that Yahweh called us out to do. We forget those things were once pleasurable to us. To escape the desensitization, people and men especially expand their fantasy desires more to novel stimuli. He said this leads and gains to more fatigue. So we remember what desensitization is. Remember where we're desensitized, where these things are brought forth through entertainment. And it desensitizes. It gets us used to these things to where now it doesn't seem that bad. It doesn't seem that awful to us, to where now we readily accept these things. Desensitization impacts the prefrontal cortex. As dopamine receptors decline in the brain, so do the amount of neural cells in the prefrontal lobes. Now, how do you cure hypofrontality? It says to bring the prefrontal lobes back into working order, a two-pronged attack is needed. The old neural pathways must be starved. And 2, the neural pathways must be built and fed, increasing dopamine levels in a way that build up the prefrontal context. Starve. That's the first one. It says don't give in to the urge. As the prefrontal lobes are given plenty of time to rest, executive control will be strengthened over time. Come out from among it. Be separate. Don't partake in the sins anymore. Separate yourself from the ways of the world. Starve it. Cut off Satan to where she can't teach you anymore. Cut off the entertainment. Cut off the ways of life. Those who pull you into sin, cut it out of your life. Remember what Yeshua Messiah said. He who looks upon a woman has already committed adultery with her in his heart. That's where the desires are. And he said, whatever it is that causes you to do this, cut it off and throw it away from you. Get it away from you. And to many, this feels like a catch-22. He says, you tell me I have to kill my willpower. I have to stop watching fantasy or participating in things that I fantasize about to pull my mind off reality. So now the way to increase my willpower is by willing myself not to watch it. Well, how does that work? Isn't that like telling the alcoholic to just stop it? Just telling someone to stop it without offering a solution. That's not Yahweh's way. Yahweh offers a solution. He gives us an example of how to stop everything. The big difference between just stop it and a conscious effort is to rewire your brain is this. He says the person being told to just stop it has no hope that the cravings will ever be different. Remember Cain. He was instructed, the desire to sin is with you, but you must overcome it. You must overcome that desire. That's what we must overcome. We must change our heart's desire by refocusing what it is. What are our goals? Where is our true treasure? He says when he hears just stop it, he hears live with this intense cravings the rest of your life and never give in to them. The addict, or the one who fantasizes, it says telling him to stop is like telling him to die. Because we believe those who get pulled into fantasy, their mind becomes that that's their life. The fantasy is the real world. And the House of Yahweh is not the real world. All right, they believe that the fantasy is where they actually belong. And that's what the Catholic Church has used for years. Remember, pastors giving us examples year after years of carnivals and things like this. It pulls your mind off reality and pulls it into this fantasy world. It says, however, informed by the process of how our brains can change, the addict can avoid fantasy and knowing that real change is possible. Change is built into the very fabric of our brains. Change is exactly what our brains are designed to do. And when this person abstains from fantasy, he thinks, okay, this really stinks now. I feel horrible. But I will not always feel this way. In fact, I aim to reclaim my brain so I can experience real, lasting pleasure again. Coming to Yahweh's house, being a willing participant in Yahweh's house, that should be the pleasure we seek. Now here are some helpful tips for avoiding fantasy. Now this is going to sound real familiar. It's going to be taking the peaceful solution and coupling it with these ideas. You can see how to stop. We're told to stop and think. Stop and think of your options. Well, we have to be able to understand, exactly how can we do that. Well, here are some options. Redirection. When you feel the urge or you get into the habit of distracting yourself with another activity, start another activity immediately. When negative thoughts start coming in, redirect those thoughts. Redirection to positive thoughts. Find something that we can do creative, something in the work of Yahweh, something that pulls our mind off our own self and those false fantasies. It says avoid external triggers. Remember, you carved a Grand Canyon-sized gorge of neural circuits in your mind. And it's easy for everyday experiences to become triggers. The trigger is a specific channel on TV. Refuse to visit that channel. If the trigger is a type of person you see walking down the street, choose to bounce your eyes away from that person. Learn what your triggers are and for several weeks or months, completely avoid them. No exceptions. Cut it off. Don't allow Satan to be our teacher anymore. Because as long as we allow her to teach us, we're going to do what she tells us to do. Avoid internal triggers. External triggers are the things you experience in the world, and internal triggers are emotions or states of mind. For some, when they feel lonely, this has become a trigger to fantasize and has become the release valve that makes them feel good. Identify what your internal triggers are, whether it's loneliness, boredom, exhaustion, anger, and create an escape plan when these emotions pop up. He says, call a friend. Now, he says call a friend. I say call a counselor. Call out to Yahweh and ask for Yahweh's help. Do something creative and avoid suds. Now, a sud is a seemingly unimportant decision. Now, these are rationalizations. In other words, this is iniquity. This is making an excuse for what we're doing. All right? These are rationalizations you say to yourself to get one step closer to your fantasy. I'm just going to watch the 10 o'clock news. Come 1 o'clock in the morning, we're still watching TV. All right? That's something that we have to learn to get rid of. He says, I'm just going to avoid, I'm going to be checking my email. I'm just going to go check my email. Well, how many things can pop up on emails? I'm just going to go to Facebook. And this is one thing he puts on here. I'm just going to go look at Facebook. How many things can that pull us into? Fill up your social calendar to the brim and refuse to give yourself an open window. In other words, all right, socializing, that means going and participating in Yahweh's work. Coming to the sanctuary, being involved in Yahweh's house, socializing with righteous fellowship. And yes, praise Yahweh. Now continue on here. He says, much like a muscle, the more you exercise the prefrontal cortex, the stronger it becomes. The goal is to engage in new habits that will increase your dopamine and dopamine receptors. In other words, to make those connections. And this last part right here, he says, whatever rewarding activity is pursued, it needs to be an activity that is reoccurring. Building new rewarding neural pathways requires time and ongoing repetition. Neurons that fire together, wire together. Remember Pastor talking about the electrical connections inside of our brain? Repeating a pleasurable activity instead of compulsive activity, such as fantasy, forms a new circuit that is gradually reinforced instead of the compulsion. He says neurons that fire apart, wire apart. When a person refuses to act on compulsion, it weakens the link between the activity and the idea it will provide relief. Now here's the one thing that helps, and just picture this. Picture actually doing this when something negative pops into your thought, pops into your mind, a negative thought. He says destroy fantasies. A fantasy or thought enters your mind, picture the image being eliminated. Draw a red X over it, smash it with a hammer, put it through a shredder, or flush it down the nastiest toilet you've ever seen. Replace that negative thought. Get it out. Destroy it. Replace it with righteousness. And the way we do that is by studying, getting our minds back on the work of Yahweh, getting our minds off the foolishness of this world, and remembering that great treasure we once had when we came here. Don't forget it. Don't let it go. Grab a hold of it. And cut the other stuff out of our lives before we cut ourselves off completely from Yahweh. Praise Yahweh. If you'll all stand, I have the great pleasure and opportunity to present to you the great Kahan Ilya Hawkins.
Shabbat Shalom, everyone. You may all be seated. Today in the news, we're going to have two discs. So after the first one is done, there'll be a second one come up, and it'll be fairly short. But we're going to have about 21 minutes of news. First up is speaking of, and they're reporting this globally, is they're calling the things taking place in Oklahoma with the drought, they're calling it the second Dust Bowl. And they're showing how the wheat crop has become the worst wheat crop in the last 50 years. And of course, these people that are raising wheat in Oklahoma today, well, they were not raising wheat during the Dust Bowl. So they're seeing the worst of the worst coming along with these droughts. But these droughts are globally. Don't let anyone tell you that it's centrally located. It's global. And then we have Monsanto. Of course, Monsanto is making wheat so it's worthless, worth nothing, to the point where even countries such as Russia has banned it from their country. It's not allowed in their country. President Putin even saying that this could lead to World War III if this is pushed, this wheat that's being pushed, genetically modified wheat. And of course, also Israel and Palestine is growing worse. The emotions are still building. The amount of people are growing that's dying. There's no peace. And of course, they're crying out for the ones who were negotiating these peace treaties, which is Russia, the UN, the United States, and the United Nations. But they're in war themselves. They're in disagreement themselves. And of course, a house divided against itself will not stand. Also, Russia, China, and Brazil is looking to create a new currency to get rid of the dollar so they can have a new system of operating. So, of course, their lives aren't hurt by the sanctions that are being placed on them, which is governed by the American dollar. And, of course, also a passenger jet shot down over Ukraine. And they're debating who shot it down, when they shot it down, what was it shot with, and, of course, who's responsible for it. And then last but not least, that plane that was shot down had 100 scientists that were heading to Australia for a conference on AIDS. Now think, that jet was flying at 33,000 feet, and every vial those scientists had with them is also released in the atmosphere. It's airborne. So keep that in mind. So if we could please play the news.
Pay close attention. What you're about to see is Bible prophecy being fulfilled.
Welcome to another edition of YPN News, bringing you news as it relates to Bible prophecy and foretold by Yisrayl Hawkins. Well, today we're going to cover the effects of climate change and our food supply, as well as bringing you up to date on recent events taking place in Ukraine and Russia, as well as the current events taking place with Israel and Hamas. We're going to start our broadcast off with climate change. As you know, we've reported on how Yisrayl Hawkins has foretold of the consequences that man's activities of rejecting and breaking the moral laws that govern healthy living would have on not only their own bodies, but the atmosphere. In fact, the entire world's ecosystem. Drought conditions continue to plague America's heartland, with 61.8% of the contiguous United States under moderate to severe levels of drought. The conditions are so bad, experts are warning, that conditions similar to the Great Dust Bowls of the 1930s are going to be returning to the Midwest.
Wow. Now, in the great state of Oklahoma, the western part of that state is in either exceptional or extreme drought. In fact, drought conditions are so dire in Oklahoma, the wheat commissioner says that this year's wheat crop will go down as one of the worst in decades, down 38% from the average, and it could eventually affect prices at the grocery store and cause farmers to lose a lot of money. Now, Tom Glazier, an Oklahoma farmer, is worried because in his last 50 years of farming, he said that this is the worst drought that he has ever seen in 50 years.
Oh, I bet it's got to be frustrating as well. Despite how bad his crop is, he's thankful to be able to harvest at least half his crop. Now, consumers will eventually feel the pinch of a bad wheat crop, but it won't be overnight. The price of wheat products on the shelves today is the result of last year's harvest. So, Jeff, it'll be a year or so before we see any significant changes or increases into the price, depending on how well watered the wheat crop actually gets this year.
Now, meteorologists say that the combination of a hard winter with a hard April freeze and very little rain this year to date are all contributing factors. Currently, Oklahoma is behind 7 inches for total rainfall for the year. And of course, keep in mind, Katan, that western Oklahoma never came out of that state of extreme drought this year. Those conditions were creeping further eastward now, so they're coming into the state, but they already were in that extreme drought before the year started.
So it's kind of like adding injury to insult.
That's right.
On another topic of wheat, you've probably heard the word gluten before, haven't you? Now, it's a protein found in wheat and other grain products. Well, as many as 18 million Americans may be suffering from gluten-related illnesses, and that's due to the genetically modified soy and corn they eat, and those genetically modified foods are at the root of a growing epidemic, a survey reveals. In fact, one restaurant in New York, For Foods, has seen an increase in business because they cater to a growing market, one that prefers non-GMO and gluten-free foods. In fact, the gluten-free lifestyle has boomed into a multi-billion-dollar-a-year industry.
Now, in fact, the multinational company Monsanto is the biggest producer of genetically modified seeds.
That's not the first time we've heard Monsanto in relation to negatively affecting the public's health. Well, now on to another hot topic of discussion, Russia and Brazil. The two countries are in a discussion to develop a system to compete with the World Bank, the IMF, and the U.S. dollar. In fact, Russia, China, and Brazil are working on a deal to put together a competing currency. All of the countries involved have something to gain as they are looking for ways to expand the market for their products, as well as creating business partners with others outside of the United States.
Now, we continue our report with the latest on the events in the Middle East as Israel agreed to 5-hour ceasefire as a result of the UN appeal for humanitarian efforts. Now, all of this as the death toll of Palestinians is rising and now stands at 213. Now, many Israeli shells have been fired into the Gaza Strip, one hitting a fishing boat and another striking a beach where 4 young Palestinian boys were playing a game of football, killing all 4 boys. As Israel continues to fulfill its pledge to hit Hamas hard, it's been targeting the homes of Hamas leaders, striking 4 Hamas leaders' homes, but killing none of them.
Well, the Israelis have even been dropping leaflets close to the border, urging residents of the Gaza Strip to flee. The leaflet letter read, "For your own safety, we request that you vacate your residence immediately. The Israeli Defense Force does not wish to harm you or your family. Those who disregard these instructions endanger their own lives and the lives of their families." According to reports, Hamas got on the local radio after the leaflets were dropped, of course, and told the citizens, "Don't believe it. Don't move. It's propaganda. The Israelis simply want you to move out so they can move in."
Now, as for those 4 boys who were killed in the Israeli attacks, their bodies were being laid to rest. The agitated imam said, "Our battle with the enemy will never end." Katana shows you how the emotions are so high and it keeps going back and forth and the emotions are building, and as a result it's just more retaliation that we see taking place.
And the people obviously have no hope. They have nowhere to turn. Wow. Well, now we turn our focus over to Larry McGee with an update on the state of affairs in Ukraine and Russia. Larry, we hear there's reports about Ukraine firing shells into Russia, and some talk about sanctions also being levied against Russia. Just how accurate are these reports?
The reports are true, Katan, and at this point, one Russian citizen has been confirmed dead after missiles fired from the Ukraine on Sunday struck several homes in the Russian town of Dangus, which is situated on the Russian border. The Ukrainian government has denied any participation in the attack, but in a statement released by the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Russian officials say these facts are evidence of a dangerous escalation on Russia's borders with Ukraine that creates a higher level of danger for Russian citizens. It could bring about irreversible consequences which Ukraine would be responsible for. According to the West, however, it is not the Ukraine but Russia who needs to be called to account. And this week, the U.S. imposed its toughest sanctions thus far on the Russian bear for its alleged support of Ukrainian rebels. The penalties, which are aimed at Russia's banks as well as its energy and defense companies, were announced by the U.S. Treasury Department in a move which the Obama administration hopes will communicate to Russia that it will pay a price for its actions. In a press meeting this week, the president said the sanctions were designed to have the maximum impact on Russia while limiting any spillover effect on American companies or its allies. The president also stated that the actions are being taken in close consultation with America's European allies who are meeting in Brussels to agree on their next steps. Meanwhile, the Pentagon reports that Russia has increased its forces on the Ukrainian border to 12,000 troops.
Now, Larry, we're hearing some more reports that there was additional trouble over the Ukraine-Russian border, and we're hearing that a passenger plane was possibly shot down with a missile or a rocket. What do we know about this developing story?
Well, at this point, Jeff, the U.S. military strongly suspects that it was a surface-to-air missile which was responsible for bringing down Malaysia Airlines Flight 17. Of course, this is the second tragedy for the airline this year after Flight 370 went missing over the Indian Ocean several months ago. Flight 17 was making its way from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur when it crashed in eastern Ukraine, where a battle is reported to be raging between Russian loyalists and Ukrainian government. No one is reported to have survived. So far, officials say it is not clear who fired the suspected missile or whether or not the passenger jet was being targeted deliberately. Those questions, analysts say, will be answered during the investigative phase, where many people hope American and/or British experts will play a strong part.
All 298 people that were on board this flight, what do we know about the people? What do we know about the cargo of this flight?
Well, one interesting detail, Katan, a tough blow on one hand and horrifying on the other, is that among the people who perished in the crash were as many as 108 AIDS researchers and scientists who were headed to an international AIDS conference in Melbourne. AIDS research and activist communities lament the scientist's death as a crushing blow, but even more horrifying is the fact that among the possessions of the scientists, which were blown apart and scattered in the air, was tens of vials of the AIDS virus.
Wow, amazing. Well, what's to become of those vials of AIDS now?
All right, they're going to be in the atmosphere.
That's right.
Well, in other news this week, Syrian President Bashar al-Assad was sworn in for a third term at the presidential palace in Damascus. Assad took the oath of office despite the fact that a 4-year-long civil war continues to rage in his country. Now, in an address to his supporters, he declared victory over those he called terrorists and also warned countries who had backed the rebels.
President Bashar al-Assad said, "Soon we will see that the Arab, regional, and Western states that supported terrorism, will pay high price, and many people will understand late that the battle in which the Syrian people are fighting to defend its country is a battle to defend many other people that will be facing the same terrorism sooner or later. And as a final note, the U.S. and other countries have dismissed Assad's re-election as a sham.
Now, a quick ISIS update. Iraq government forces had to pull back from an attempt to retake the city of Tikrit, which had been captured by ISIS fighters last month. Heavy resistance from Sunni insurgents forced the government to pull back as they hoped to regain control over Tikrit, which was once a stronghold of former Saddam Hussein loyalists.
Israel and Hamas continued the bloodshed this week with no signs of ending this conflict that started July 8, 2014. The Israeli operation, dubbed Protective Edge, is taking a heavy toll inside Gaza, with at least, as reported, 213 Palestinians being killed and more than 1,100 wounded. The stated objective is to halt Palestinian rocket attacks on Israel. But the United Nations says the majority of those killed in Gaza have been, sadly to say, civilians.
Now, as the Israeli attacks continue, medical sources say dozens of Palestinians, including children, have died from suffocation due to inhaling poisonous gas. The Palestinian Health Ministry spokesman said a strange white toxic gas is being launched by the Israeli army during its ground invasion into Gaza. Now, doctors have urged Palestinians to protect themselves against the toxic gas by sealing their safe rooms. So they're saying, don't let this gas come in. It's poisonous.
I think that'd be scary being in a situation like that. Israel says it uses a variety of techniques to warn civilians of planned attacks, including dropping leaflets, as we mentioned earlier, and also sending recorded telephone messages to civilian homes. One such message states, "For your safety, you have to evacuate your house as soon as possible and go to the center of the city before 8 o'clock in the morning on Wednesday."
Now, when the airstrikes do finally take place, a final warning known as roof knocking is conducted, in which a smaller, less powerful missile hits the roof of the intended target. Now, it hits that first, and then several minutes later, the main strike occurs, followed by possible a second strike, eventually demolishing the building. So the first, what they call the roof knock, is to actually give the people, they're saying, time to evacuate, and then minutes later, they destroy the building.
Well, what occurs when people are sleeping at nighttime? How much time do they really have? Wow, sad case. The Israeli Defense Forces recently released footage said to show an airstrike being aborted to spare civilian lives. A voice is heard on the video saying, "We have identified a civilian on the roof in less than 20 meters. Copy that. Let's move to the next target."
So now all of this sounds great, but as the Palestinian death toll rises, some say these warnings don't always come. Now, the funeral for the Hoj family was held this week. They were asleep in their beds, as you were asking about what takes place.
Right.
Here's an example. They were in their beds when the Israeli airstrike hit, which flattened their home. As a result, they were all killed. Now, the neighbors said they didn't warn us. It was the first time they hit a house without any warning.
Wow. Now, human rights groups argue, warning or no warning, airstrikes in civilian areas are never justified, and just because an individual might be associated with the Palestinian military, it should not make his entire building and everyone inside that building a target. However, Israel says while airstrikes are theirs, the responsibility belongs to Hamas.
Now, Naftali Bennett, Israeli Economy Ministry, said Hamas is killing its own civilians, and here's where you see why they say the rockets may be ours, but here's why you're responsible. He continued, he said, when you put a family as a human shield defending missile launchers, when you hide missiles and weapons within hospitals, you are responsible for killing your own civilians. Now, so far, the first time, this is the first time that Israel is pointedly telling some Palestinians to leave their homes, warning Israel will, quote, strike with might.
It's almost like, punching someone in the stomach and saying that, they're the ones that are making me do this. They're responsible for me punching you in the stomach. It doesn't make any sense. And, of course, there's no winners in this.
Now, as we can see, there's no end to the violence in this world when its leaders are only looking for reasons to harm their neighbor. Now, Yisrayl Hawkins is teaching the opposite of this, how to love your neighbor. Now, if you want to learn how to find peace and safety in your life and the lives of your loved ones, and how to have peace with your neighbor, then contact the House of Yahweh for your free monthly newsletter and Prophetic Word magazine. Here's how.
To contact the House of Yahweh, you can write them at the House of Yahweh, P.O. Box 2498, Abilene, Texas 79604. You can call them at 1-800-613-9494 or visit them on the web at any of their websites, www.yahweh.com, www.yisraelhawkins.com, or www.yahwehsbranch.com. You can also email them at info@yahweh.com, and for any calls outside the United States, please dial the number on your screen.
Now, don't go anywhere. Up next is another exciting and informative message from Yisrayl Hawkins. From all of us here at YPN News, I'm Jeffrey Heimerman.
And I'm Katan Alexander.
Thanks for watching.
If everyone will please stand at this time, I'd like to introduce the greatest teacher of peace, the greatest teacher in the world, the great Kahan, Yisrayl Abel Hawkins.
Wow. Shalom, everyone. Praise Yahweh. What a crowd. Getting ready for feast. You may be seated. May the peace of Yahweh be with each and every one of you. I don't know how much of that you could understand, but it's the only thing great about it that I see is the fact that we're bringing forth the remnant. The house of Yahweh is bringing forth the remnant through His house at this time, His last days established house that will stop war and fighting. Praise Yahweh. It was the great Father Yahweh who brought us to this God-forsaken land, so Pastor Yisrayl Hawkins could teach us of His great plan to be continued. Sounds like a song to me, Yosef, Michael Ossoff. That was on my Sabbath bread this morning. I don't know if you could hear all that, but 298 people was on that plane, all of them dead, scattered over a 9-mile area, I do believe. There was, out of that group of people, there was 108 scientists. These were AIDS scientists. They had AIDS vials with them on the plane. Nothing is said about where those vials are. Did they explode? Did they scatter in the wind? But it was AIDS. Now, I could see how this would quickly get into the firmament, of course, and add more difficulty to the microorganisms that bring forth the rain, snow, and so forth. Everything that man does, it turns against him. Now, if you remember the sermons, by the way, I was so pleased this morning because all the sermons that was brought, it was like they were building you up for this the sermon that I'm fixing to bring, the next 10 sermons that I hope to bring quickly. But they were building you up for it, and bits and pieces. Every speaker, from the two priestly boys that desire to be priests all of their life, they say, and trying to serve right now, and then the great Kohan Yeshua. All of these just falls right in line with it, as you'll see. This headlines on this one: ISIS calls for Muslims to conquer Rome. This we know is going to take place. I mean, they're not going to conquer it. They're going to blow it up with nuclear bombs. And I don't know exactly, the Scripture doesn't give the details on that, but it's we do know that Rome is going to burn with a nuclear burning. I wouldn't want to be there. I think the Pope is making haste to get out of there right now and get back to the temple in Jerusalem. That's what they're hoping for. The Yahweh'sBranch.com, there's over 10,091, I believe. It's a little bit hard to make this out, but it's over 10,031 that has read the newspaper reports that the House of Yahweh puts out weekly now, and is putting them on, over 10,000 of them is putting them on their websites to be read by all of their people, all of their friends. So that adds to the pot of, now last week's news is up to 156,000 newspapers, 156,570. One before that, 132,000. So you can see how this would multiply. And the one before that, 120,937. This one today, nonprofit group urges politicians to let foreign children come to the U.S. for training in new proposal. That's up to 47,182. The last figure I had on it. Praise Yahweh. So the Pope heard of this, and he agreed. He agreed with Yisrayl Hawkins of the House of Yahweh and said they need to let these children come to the United States and take care of them. I thought that was great of him. First thing he and I agreed on, except he wants the United States to take care of them. He didn't say anything about coming to Rome, did he? He didn't say anything about bringing these immigrants to Rome, and he would help take care of them there. But nobody wants to go to Rome because of the priest there. They're afraid of the priest. I don't blame them. I am too. especially the children. So that may be a reason for it. He knows they don't want to come to Rome. The keys of this blood. Now this is what I've been trying to explain, and you've got to get this. It's a vital point, vital understanding that you get the fact that Yahweh gave this kingdom that is going to rule the entire universe. Not after the forced rule like we have today with the Vatican. This is forced rule that you're seeing now, much like the oppression that you saw in Egypt. And our forefathers went through this in Egypt, and it was forced rule. It's much like it is today, by the way, in the United States. A man and his wife is forced to go out in order to make a living and pay for the cars, the automobiles, the TV sets, computers, the gas bills, water bills, toilet bills that's going back into your water. We got to pay for that too. All of that is coming out of their paycheck, so it takes the both of them to make a living. And of course, if one of them loses their jobs, the cars are gone, the house is gone. So you can see the oppression that we're under in the United States. And of course, there are foreclosing on them, still foreclosing daily on people who get behind with their payments because they lost their job or the business went broke and shut down. The things that are growing the fastest, of course, is the hospitals. Hospitals, doctors, and nurses, and now they're getting behind in their work and holding the patients up too long. Some of them are dying before they can get an appointment to see their doctors, and these are veterans, even veterans that have fought the wars for our country now. And several of them had died, and they're having an investigation, of course. They investigate everything. They never come to a conclusion on what could help the matter. It's like 41 wars. Now get this, boys. 41 wars is now raging in the world. 41. You don't hear of all of these, but that's what's going on in the world today. The kingdom that was given to Moshe, which Yeshua upheld, was not a kingdom of force. It was a kingdom of unity. And of course, the only thing that brought the disunity, the main thing that were shown in the scriptures, was Korah. Now, Yahweh brought that forth to show you how disunity could upset the kingdom. And of course, Yeshua showed that no one is going to make it into the kingdom of Yahweh unless you're totally in unity with Yahweh. And of course, he put his house in these last days to teach this lesson. No one on earth is teaching this except us. Yeshua lived this perfectly. And if we are as Yeshua, then we are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise to Abraham. We're his seed and his heirs according to the promise, if we will be like Yeshua. If you remember in Hebrews 4, Yeshua, whom they classify this as Yeshua ben Nun. And his name in the King James Version is Joshua, so you'll understand. I told you, find me the high priest of Yeshua ben Nun. He had a high priest. He wasn't a high priest. They're telling lies when they say he was a high priest. He wasn't a high priest. He disqualified himself from being a high priest. You can't be a high priest under those conditions. But anyway, I said, I think I might have said something wrong because I still haven't got the answer to that. Who was Yeshua ben Nun's high priest? Now, if you find that, then you'll know that he wasn't a high priest, and of course that high priest led him all the days of his life. And it would surprise you. I'll probably read his name today and tell you, but I'm not going to tell you this was his high priest. I want you, especially the priestly boys, to find this. That's give you something to go on. And I notice there's more and more of the boys that's desiring to be priest, and I see them up here saying, "Hey, can I get your attention, please? Please, let me have your attention." I think this is beautiful. We got the same thing going on with the priestly girl. Those, you're going to shine like the stars of heaven very soon. All of you. Yes. Teachers. Now, I keep harping at the adult teachers, saying you need to be pushing these children into teaching. And of course, everyone here needs to promote this. You really need to get behind this, attend the services, listen to them teach, applaud them, push them, encourage them. Don't discourage them. Don't discourage them. Don't ever say you're boring. You know, what's boring is you're being boring in your own mind. Cheer up and get to listen to what these people say, these young people. They're bringing forth the words of Yahweh. Praise Yahweh. But now, Yahweh gave Moshe, he promised it to Abraham. What he actually promised to Abraham was you. Yes, you. You are the finishing of this kingdom that will resurrect Abraham even. You're the ones that's going to have the power. The first, the last will be first, Yahshua said. So you're the ones that's going to be the finishing of this. When the seventh Malach speaks, when this work is done here, this brings forth all the secrets of Yahweh that he has, that he's never shown mankind. None of the prophets have ever brought this forward in full. They've brought bits and pieces, but they've never brought it forward in full that you're getting today. Well, Yahweh promised Abraham, he said, because you have kept my laws, my statutes, and my judgments. Y'all all know where that is, right? Genesis 26, verse 5. Genesis 26. I saw some saying it. 26, verse 5. Genesis 26, verse 5. Because you kept my laws, statutes, and judgments, that he's going to use Abraham, that is his genes. His genes. Now, I know you've been studying this. Our great Kohan in Africa is teaching. He's probably the world's best teacher of microorganisms. But in one of his, praise Yahweh, in one of his discs that I was watching where he was teaching the boys, and I was watching it last night, and it was so fascinating because he had drawings, and he showed the gene replacement, where a bad gene gets in a person's body, and you know your genes is a pattern of your whole life. It was put in the egg, the sperm, the sperm and the egg of the mother. Before you were born, it was placed in Abraham and Sarah and other women. And that gene, where he showed this gene replacement. Now, if Abraham had accidentally, we know that you can eat unclean foods, that changes your genes. Can change your genes. You break the laws that govern your lust, and that can change your genes. But now, this can be done by accident. Someone told me that, they're having trouble because they wanted to watch the news, but here is the temptations coming their way. Well, Yahshua suffered those temptations too. What tempted Yahshua? What tempted Yahshua? You remember? Remember the scripture? He was tempted in all points like as we. That was his temptation. All points, he said. Yes, he was a human being, so he was tempted in all points like you, but he proved to you that you can be tempted and not sin. You don't have to follow through with it. You can say, "Get behind me, Satan," rapidly. Or you can say, "Well, I want to enjoy this scene for a while." Well, of course, that's the stupidity of Christianity, but and of course Cain. But this takes us back to Cain and Abel. Yahweh taught Abel righteousness. Abel chose righteousness to follow. Cain chose war. He chose to follow his lust. Well, lust can be brought forth with anger. And of course, Cain was rejected. You see the same thing with Korah, if you'll get the picture. If you get the picture, you'll see that Cain was rejected from being the leader in the house of Yahweh, Abel had the best office, and Cain thought he could kill Abel and he could take over the house of Yahweh. How many times have you seen that since the house of Yahweh was established? Well, of course, that's the character there that we're seeing here. But now, from those seed came forth Abraham, from those genes. And then Yahweh said he chose Abraham because he kept these laws, statutes, and judgments. And he said, I know that he will teach these to the world. Well, you're the last part of these genes. And when a gene, like if Abraham had a gene, and they showed this in a diagram, the great teacher, the Kohan in Africa, he was speaking person to person with our team here and teaching them microbiology. And he showed how a bad gene, your body of a righteous person, if they accidentally get a bad gene, it can be replaced by your other genes. It can actually be taken out and another one slid in its place. Yes. And you know, the scientists are trying to do this now. They're trying to replace cancer genes because they know you can get a cancer gene. Well, how did you get it? Through the uncontrolled lust, unclean food, yes, and giving in to it. And of course, the STDs that follow. Those three things. It takes those three things to bring forth the cancer in your body. And of course, not eating salt. Remember, one of our students this morning was showing you the importance of eating salt. Well, and that's the reason Yahweh said, sprinkle every sacrifice with salt. Yeshua said, take salt in your bodies and be joyous. Rejoice. Yes, it's a very joyous thing when you eat a group of French fries that's made with the right kind of oil. And they're really tasty too, I can tell you, especially if you hit that salt shaker a little heavy, I think. And you bring joy to your body. This builds joy. Get salt within yourself. Well, and he did an excellent job on this, I thought. Praise Yahweh. Well, Abraham, if he got a bad gene, it would have been quickly replaced by his body because he kept Yahweh's laws, statutes, and judgment. And by keeping his laws, statutes, and judgments will change your genes, keep them going regularly. And if one sneaks in like you didn't know that pork was in that can when you got it, and you didn't look close enough at the label, and you ate it, or whatever, you know, they said this E. coli now. You're now breathing E. coli. You're breathing it. Well, if you didn't get it that way, you'd get it through the commode because it's going back into your drinking water. So, and these things they can't take out. You know, they can get a certain amount of things out of the toilet water, but they can't get everything. If you remember, there's been a lot of tests run showing that AIDS can penetrate where this doctor said, where nothing else can, and they can't get it out. And she said, yes, fluorine will kill it if it's 90%. But who's putting 90% water, fluoride in their drinking water? Well, of course, no one is. So you're not killing it there either. So this stuff is coming back to us big time. But your body can fight this. And this was a doctor, by the way, that told somebody that when he was asked, well, how could this possibly take place? And they said you could even get it when you in breathing, you know, because it's in the air. E. coli bacteria. Well, of course, we know that. We've known it for years that it's in the firmament. So is the AIDS virus in the firmament. If I don't know what these vials that these AIDS scientists were carrying, 108 scientists were carrying, but there's going to an AIDS convention to get ready for more money to come in, to pull more money in. And there's carrying all these vials with them. Now, if this gets into the firmament, then you'll be breathing that probably in 3 days. You're going to be breathing the death too, because they haven't buried these bodies. You've got 298 bodies there, all dead. They've been there since Thursday in hot weather. They say that they won't let anyone go near there. Who would want to go near there? I'm thinking probably, well, enough of that. But you see what's going on in the world. It's getting worse. Every day it's getting worse. Now wait till they drop the nuclear bombs and you'll see even more so. You're going to see more of everything. More diseases, more trouble raised, because people are going to start organizing themselves into squads. This is what took place when they brought the children of Israel out of Egypt. They were in squads already. And each tribe was fighting each other. And even the tribes were fighting among themselves. But they had, you come and join me and we can protect ourselves. This is what the Nimrod teaching. Let's build this big tower so we can protect ourselves. Let's become strong militarily. That's what started your Roman army. And it did become strong. Well, it's strong today. And of course, this kingdom that Yahweh put together, they still have a little of that strength now. Now get this, because Daniel showed this. They still have some of the strength of Yahweh in this mighty image, and the feet and the toes of brass and clay, mixed with clay. So they still have a little of the strength that Yahweh gave to Moshe, that came from Abraham, of course, into these 12 tribes, but it had a mixture. It had a mixture. Korah. He was cousins with Moshe and Aaron. I'll show you that. I got a chart where I can show you how close he was. And of course his descendants, if you remember, Yahweh said, all the firstborn are mine. Remember that scripture? All the firstborn are mine. Well, after this incident with Korah and Abraham, were 250 people leaders. These were leaders of Israel. They weren't just tag-alongs. They were leaders. Imagine 250 leaders there with this man. And that wasn't all of them. Some of them wouldn't even come. And they sent a message to Moshe saying, no, we're not going to come up there, because they knew they was going to be destroyed. They figured that Yahweh was going to destroy anybody that didn't stand on the side of Moshe. And of course, that's a fact. And a lesson should be learned right there. And Yeshua taught it best when he said, if you're not in unity, you're not going to make it. And you are going to be destroyed. Well, this was an example of it, of course. But Korah had 250 leaders with him stand before Moshe. Those that didn't stand sent a message to Moshe saying, you have taken all these offices to yourself. And we are the ones that should be in those offices, not you. We are the priest. We should be the priest, not you. We should be the high priest, not you. So this was the message. And after the earth swallowed them up, then fire came down from heaven and devoured a few more thousand that was protesting. Now this was a great example of Yahweh saying, no, this is not going to be at this time. I'm building some genes that is going to keep going here to bring forth a Savior for you stiff-necked and rebellious. Well, those two now listen, those two, those people, Korah and all of his people there, they are going to be resurrected too. And I would say they never did have their minds open, or they never would have done this in the first place. So when you resurrect them, you're going to give them 100 years to live, along with everyone else that hasn't been called. Yes. Now that's you. That's you and your decisions. That's what Yahweh has already lined out for you to be doing when this resurrection takes place. And you're going to appoint teachers over them. Teachers. You see why I say we need teachers? Yes, I'd be willing to train 1,000 every 30 days if I could, or 1,000,000 every 30 days if I could. and have them teaching the world. But that's not in Yahweh's plan right now. What is in Yahweh's plan is 2 billion people, of course. But that's the reason the teachers are going to shine like the stars in heaven, because you're going to be given great glory. First off, you're going to have the power to resurrect the dead. This is going to be pretty prestigious when they see this and see that you have resurrected. Hey, you resurrected me? Yes. Well, you know, that's somebody you would want to follow, I would think, and get close to. You know, someone who resurrects you from the dead. Well, how did you do this? Well, Yahweh gave me the power. And I can teach it to you, but it takes about 40 years to learn this. Remember, they wandered around in the wilderness 40 years. What do you think they were doing there that 40 years? They were taking lessons from Moshe and his high priest and all of those other priests. Now think, there was 250 leaders with Korah. How many were they with Aaron and Moshe? You know, they had a crew here. Now, it became more than that. The kingdom of Yahweh grew by leaps and bounds. It didn't set, you know, it grew. And by the time they reached Jerusalem and Solomon built the temple, this kingdom had spread to all nations, all the areas, all over the world, because they kept leaving and going out and settling in other places, and they're teaching this kingdom. But this kingdom was not Yahweh's at that time. It had been taken over by violence and force. Violence and force. Even the house of Yahweh that Solomon built, they forbid the name to be called Yahweh any longer. It couldn't be called the house of Yahweh any longer. Well, what was it called? The house of God. The house of the Lord. Remember? That's what they changed it to. So what do you have sitting on the 7 hills of Rome today? You have this great city that reigns over the kings of the earth. You have the temple of the gods. And if you ever go there, look at the gods. They're everywhere at the tops of the buildings looking down on you. All of them uncircumcised, of course, because they don't keep the laws. So that's the way they're standing, and their statutes show this. But they're all across the main buildings. You walk inside, and they're everywhere in there in paintings. There's no room that you can go in that doesn't have these gods displayed. The gods and lords. Who are these gods and lords? They're the dead people. They're dead. They know not anything, but they're worshiping them. So who represents them? Who representing these gods and lords? The gods. Remember Genesis 3:5. It says, do this, practice evil, and you will be like the gods. That's what's going on in Rome. They don't keep the commandments of Yahweh, so they're not practicing righteousness. This is the temple of the gods, and they worship all the gods. Remember, they have an All Saints' Day? Well, that started out to be worship this saint on this day. This is the day he died, so worship him on this day, the day of his death. They got to be so many that they were taking off all these days to worship these gods, and so they said, we can't do this. We got to have workers. Got to have somebody to cook the meals, feed the sheep, whatever. And so they said, well, let's just make one day and we'll worship all of these gods. What is he saying there? Be like these gods. They're following Satan. Be like these gods. That is what you're seeing in the temple, the 7 hills of Rome. In the temple of God, you're seeing that. But you're also seeing the keys of this blood. The keys of this blood, meaning Abraham. We are the children of Abraham, they're saying. And they are. But they're not keeping the laws and not going to inherit the promise. Yes, they came from the seed of Abraham, but if they were truly Abraham's children, they would be doing the works of Abraham and Yeshua. Now, if you're righteous as Yeshua, the prophet said, the apostle said, then you're Abraham's seed or children and heirs according to the promise. Heirs of what? Heirs of this great kingdom that will put to shame the one on the 7 hills of Rome. It'll put that kingdom to shame, but that's what you see operating there right now, that was given to Moshe, and that kingdom has grown. It's grown like crazy. It took over the whole world, but it's mixed with weakness. The weakness is, of course, sin. The strength that it still has, as Daniel showed, the strength of this mighty statue that he saw, had this mixture. Well, that's the weakness of sin that weakens the law to where it doesn't have the strength to control the mind. In Yahweh's laws, it converts the whole person. Remember that? Psalms 19, the laws of Yahweh are perfect, converting the whole person. Now, they don't have that. It brings unity, in other words. It brings unity to your life and being in unity with Yahweh. But they don't have that strength. They've lost it. They did away with the laws. They still have part of that strength because it organized. It was an organization that built a priesthood that they now control. They started controlling it shortly after Korah. In fact, if you remember the law now, all the firstborn belong to me. But after that incident, Yahweh says, well, now I will let them go their way. Remember, he said nothing would be withheld from them. So he said, all the Levites are now mine instead of the firstborn. He already had his firstborn, had their line going, and nothing was going to break that plan. Nothing was going to break that bloodline. He had it going his way. Yeshua was born from it. Yes, he's the one that was sinless. He was tempted in all ways like as we, but he proved that you don't have to yield to temptation. You don't have to yield to sin or lust. Well, in this great and mighty kingdom that Yahweh is going to build. It's not built yet. You're going to be the start of that. But you're going to resurrect all of these people. I would say the galaxies that is being built now and the huge planets that's 9 times or 17 times as big as the earth, Yahweh is doing that for you. You are going to need a lot of room. But then from that kingdom now, this is going to be a huge kingdom. You can see it operating from Rome today. That's the kingdom of Yahweh that was taken over and by violence and force. Violence and force. Doing away, of course, with the strength. But you're going to have the strength. So with what you're learning now, going into your subconscious mind right now, these laws of Yahweh, the peaceful solution, character education program that stops wars. Yahweh said they will learn war no more. Sin never again will ever be allowed in this kingdom. Why? Because you're going to be the rulers of it. Yeah, but you're not going to rule by force. You're going to rule by education. Yes, by teaching, which brings forth the laws of Yahweh and shows the history. You'll have all this history to go by now, starting with Cain, who brought forth Korah, of course, whose genes were attached, as you see in Genesis 49, that brings forth these genes down to us. We had the righteous genes, and we had all of these others that Yahweh says is going to be with you in the last days, and you're going to have to overcome it. That's what he tells you. You're going to have to overcome it. Well, of course, that's what you're doing now. You're learning Yahweh's laws. You're learning to practice them. That's what makes you perfect, converting the whole person. Well, he's converting you for this reason. Yes, you'll be given power. At that time, you will be reigning with Yahweh and Yeshua. When he goes forth, you'll go forth with him, covering the whole universe, he says. His plan is a great plan. That's it for you. With that plan comes forth this great strength that you'll keep forever. You'll never lose this. They'll sin never again. You will keep this, and you will be teaching it to all the universe, all the beings in the universe. Yes, there's war everywhere right now. That sounds like a bomb hit not too far from us just now. Now, Yahweh bless you, and I'll turn the service back to the next speaker. I love you.